I'm Dan Deocampo. I'm a professor of geosciences and associate dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Thanks for coming out today. And I would like to point out that it is being recorded. And oftentimes with these kinds of events, more people watch the recordings later on than actually attend. So be aware of that. We are now recording for posterity. So the purpose of this conversation is to talk a little bit about NSF, in particular, grant writing. We're very fortunate to have 4 very successful NSF grant writers with us today. What we'll do is we'll kind of go through the panel and have each of them briefly introduce the sort of NSF funding that they've had over the years. And then I would like to ask each one of them specifically to give what one tip would you recommend for new NSF investigators when preparing proposals? And then we'll just kick it up to questions and answers. And it's a small enough group that if you have questions during the conversation, please feel free to jump in or type a question into the chat box, and I'll jump in and ask it for you. Oftentimes we mute everybody in these meetings, but I think it's small enough that we don't need to do that. It starts to get very chaotic. I might mute everyone, but in the meantime, feel free to chime in and to have more of a conversation than a kind of traditional panel. So with that, I'll very briefly introduce the panelists and thank them very much for joining us. First of all, we have Rafal Angryk, who is professor of computer science and affiliate in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. He joined us here as part of our astroinformatics cluster, and his work is NSF and NASA funded. He works mostly in the world of astronomy, but also in other areas of big data, machine learning. So Rafal, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We also have Sarah Brosnan, who is professor of psychology and also affiliated with neuroscience and philosophy. And she's also the co-director of the famous GSU Language Research Center. Her work is in decision-making behavior in primates and social cognition, evolutional behavior, and many other related topics. So Sarah, thank you very much for joining us today. We also have Donald Hamelberg, who is professor of chemistry and chair of that department as well. He is a computational and biophysical chemist who studies, in particular, how proteins and RNA interact and how they mediate and interact, especially in the context of cellular signaling pathways. Donald, did I get that right? So Donald, thank you very much for joining us. And our 4th panelist that we have is Daniel Takabi, who is Associate Professor of Computer Science, who joins us as an expert in cybersecurity and privacy. He's been leading the efforts of our new Center of Excellence that's been designated by the National Security Agency in cybersecurity and privacy. He also works in machine learning, computation and privacy, and all kinds of related computational issues. So Daniel, thank you very much for joining us as well. So with that, why don't we jump right in? I'll just go in alphabetical order for now. And again, everyone, please feel free to interrupt with questions, comments, and I would invite our panelists, starting with Rafal, to share what one tip do you recommend for new NSF investigators, and what general thoughts do you have about NSF proposals?
So I kind of make a quick note on the things I want to talk about there. In my opinion, NSF changed over time. I remember when I was starting, I think it's kind of acts differently now. So in short, I'm mostly these days applying for interdisciplinary and collaborative funding. And in this context, my single major tip would be thinking about the grants as or proposals as the long-term process, right? Not thinking about, hey, I just wrote this proposal and if I get it selected, I'm in heaven. If I'm not going to get selected, I never apply for this program again. They don't understand me and I'm upset and I don't want to deal with them. The big thing for me was kind of thinking about this as a process and the process from the perspective of, if it's rejected, I'm just going to go again and again and again. And each time I'm going to try to do this better and better. What also comes to me a lot, especially in the interdisciplinary funding or collaborative funding, is basically good impressions on the very first pages and clear representations. And the reason for this is quite often those grants, those proposals are reviewed by the panelists from different environments. So you need to be able to communicate your proposal not only to your collaborators or to the research from your field, but also to this other field that you're collaborating with. And another kind of thought on this is you kind of have to also go with the trend, right? Politically, NSF is changing the names of the programs or specializations every 3 or 5 years, and they shift always, right? So you kind of wanna be on track on the things that are changing in the program names and in the collaboration. Quite often, those are useful to do with the program directors. So basically, I just track program directors when they migrate and see if they migrate in the areas that I still might be interested. So this is shortly from me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to talk more, or happy to talk about the ideas that I just had. Thanks.
Thanks, Rafal. Sarah?
Yeah, well, I follow very, very closely on what Rafal said, so I think we will be a nice pairing there because I agree with all of that. It really has changed a lot, and most of my grants, more than half anyway, from 2007 when I got my first funding, have been in their explicitly interdisciplinary initiatives, and that seems to be where a lot of the funding is these days. And they do change names, so. I was funded by a Human Social Dynamics grant, which then became the IBIS grant, the Interdisciplinary Behavior in the Social Sciences grant. They've now got something called Broaden and Build, which has a different focus because it's looking at MSIs, but it seems to be it seems to be following directly from that history of interdisciplinary social science grants. I'm actually submitting a Broaden and Build in March, so we'll see how that goes. But the program officers track along, and so you can sort of see how they're morphing. And as part of that interdisciplinarity, the program officers often have them co-reviewed by different panels, even if you don't submit to 2 panels. And I have been told repeatedly by program officers that they like to have them funded by different panels because then they both get to claim them when they go to Congress. So you should expect that if there's any way yours can be crossed across multiple panels, it will be. And they always get people outside of your specific area to do reviews on it. So I, for a long time, sat on the Angryk panel for the engineering grants. I am a social scientist, but they wanted someone on there who could say, this makes no sense to me. And what was really the most telling part to me was I would sit on there and I'd come in having read all of them and have my idea of what were the best engineering grants and wonder which ones were going to be the ones that the actual engineers thought were best. And usually what I chose, my order was exactly what they picked. So if I could understand it, so could the engineers. So I think my one tip actually is get someone outside of your specific area to read your grant and to be vicious with a red pen. And if there's anything that they don't understand or doesn't make sense, they should circle it. And you shouldn't be offended. You should take that, that whole reviewer is always right. You should take that and figure out how to make it so that it's more comprehensible. Because you have to assume that you're going to be reviewed by people who might be way outside of your area. And if they don't understand it, it won't get funded. And 2 other things I wanted to mention, one of which Rafal alluded to, program officers are really important in NSF. That's probably one of the ways in which NSF differs the most in my experience with NIH. They have a lot more autonomy and a lot more latitude. So you need to get in touch with your program officer early and often. So I usually send them an email along with a paragraph or 2 of it. I don't already know them. A paragraph or 2 of introduction and a 1-page. that I organize exactly like an NSF summary sheet. So paragraph of introduction, here are my intellectual merit, here's my intellectual merit, here are my broader impacts. Send it along, they'll get on the phone with you and they will be honest about whether it fits there, whether they're planning to have it cross-reviewed, if so, where they would have it cross-reviewed, helping you figure out how to aim it. They'll tell you bluntly if they think something needs to be tweaked or if it's a good fit. They will tell you bluntly if they don't think it's a good fit, actually. I've had program officers do that, but always in a constructive way, as in, this doesn't really fit with what I'm looking at. Because remember, NSF doesn't have as much money, so a lot of times there's something broad, like developmental psychology, but then they have a couple of specific focus areas within that area that's where they're focusing their portfolio. So you need to find out if what you're doing fits with their definition, not just with what you think it fits with. And the last thing, and this is where I think that maybe the most change has happened in NSF over the last 10 or 15 years, is the broader impacts are critically important. You have to have really, really strong broader impacts or you won't get funded. And I have seen grants that got thrown out just on the basis of having bad broader impacts. And it doesn't have to be scary. I think one of the things people forget is that a lot of what you're already doing counts as broader impacts. You just have to tell them. So if your grad students get great jobs and lots of funding and publish a lot, that's a broader impact because you're doing graduate training. Anything you do with undergrads is exceptional, which means GSU has a lot of benefits because we have so much of an undergrad focus. We're also a federally recognized MSI. So talk about the breakdown of different groups in your lab and how you're helping them out and whether you're involved in different programs to support people who are traditionally underrepresented. And then also, whatever you do, make sure you have a specific plan. So if you're organizing a conference, it needs to be very detailed. How you're going to recruit people, exactly who's going to be invited, how many people you expect, how you're going to get the administrative support to do it. And this group, I probably don't need to tell this. I do when I'm talking to the people who are doing postdoc grants. Saying you're going to have a Twitter feed does not count as a broader impact. Those usually get thrown out immediately. People don't trust social media or anything on the web. Is, you're going to run a blog. Okay, that's great. Who's going to read it? So, if you have an established blog with 5,000 followers, you're fine. But otherwise, for the rest of us, you need to have something else. So I have done broader impacts that ranged from just talking about specifically how I was going to get undergrads to a field site, and that might just be we're going to give 3 undergraduates the opportunity to go to a field site. That's still a broader impact. It's not huge, but it's specific. Here's how we're going to do it. And be sure to talk about what you've done in the past to show that you can actually do what you tell them you're going to do in the future. And don't hesitate to use a fair amount of your 15 pages on the broader impacts. I usually spend a couple of pages on that because it ends up being really important. And that's because so few of them get funded, that ends up being that sort of critical balancing point that decides what gets funded and what doesn't.
Yeah, I definitely echo how important broader impacts are. And hopefully we can come back to specifically discuss broader impacts and resources that faculty might have to build broader impacts. Okay, thanks. Let's move on. Donald, your initial thoughts?
Yeah, so the one thing I'm gonna comment on, and I think I'm just kind of paraphrasing what Sarah just said in terms of the directorate. So it's interesting because in the physical sciences, at times you do have a lot of people who think because their discipline is chemistry, automatically they should go to MPS, CHE. But you don't want to always do that. You want to actually look at what you're actually doing and then decide on the directorates to go. So an example I just want to give, I'm in the chemistry department. I'm a chemist, but I've never been funded by CHE. My funding comes from bio and specifically MCB, and the subgroup, which is the molecular biophysics. I've reviewed for CHE, but I've never really submitted grants to that. So you don't want to just pick the directorates just based on your discipline. Take a look at broad, be a bit more broad, and just go by the ideas of your research. I'm sure there are certain things I could submit to CHE, and we've had some ideas or potentially go to CHE. But all of my grants have always been submitting to MCB and the bio directorates, And so the approach I normally use, even when I was submitting my very first NIH Career Award, I was always, as Sarah said, have a one page. I've pretty much thought about the proposal, and then I'm going to write my overview, intellectual merit, broader impact. I do have that almost complete. So I normally finish that first page before I even write a sentence of the proposal itself. Because if I cannot really sit down and write that one page, I don't think I'll be able to write the proposal. And then I'll send a PDF copy to the program officer with just a very short email that has some of the summary, and then I do ask some of the questions about, whether it's appropriate for that subgroup or that MCB or whatever it is. And then so far they've come back and said, oh yeah, sure, it's fine, you can submit the proposal. And then the other thing I took advantage of, recently they started some of these office hours, and at least in bio MCB, I'm not sure if all the other divisions are doing this, and I've attended some of those just to, it's like, not necessarily because I'm looking for new funding, but I'm just curious, just as the previous speakers were saying, just to kind of get the pulse of what's going on and what the program officers are saying. And I constantly check just to see what they're funding and the kind of research they're interested in. Especially in the NCB, there was a time when I think they used to fund a lot of say fundamental enzymatic kind of activity mechanisms. So, and I think that has kind of moved to, I think, CHE under the CL, I think it's CLP is called. And then the MCB, now they're more interested in more cellular signaling. They're interested in allosteric kind of mechanism. So at least you could kind of tailor your proposals depending on the funding mechanisms. In terms of the interdisciplinary part of thing, is the way I look at it is I normally look at the proposals from a very high level, and in terms of the overarching goal. So I start off by discussing that overarching goal, and we know that, of course, that proposal writing is not the same as paper writing, right? But then you somehow have to get down to the daily stuff to do in the lab, and at every layer of it, you want to explain why you're doing this, and of course, some of the hypotheses that go with your decision for choosing this topic. And for us, it's kind of interesting and also difficult because we're computational chemists, right? We do theoretical work, and at times, it's not something you could just say, okay, I have this theory I'm working on. I do have these predictions. So when it comes to the interdisciplinary is really important in our end because we have to validate these results. And then so in the proposal, I have to figure out a way to let them know how I'm going to validate this results. And the way we normally do it is we do it by collaboration, by getting letters from collaborators, or we do it by existing published results. But even when you do it by existing published results, at times it's nice to probably have a letter from someone who's doing those kinds of experiments, that at least they're willing to share their data with you, or at least they're willing to do some kind of experiment to kind of validate your results. And then just to touch on the broader impact, I know Sarah has kind of covered almost everything I was going to say. She said it doesn't have to be new at all. It doesn't have to be new. It could be something you're already doing. And the bottom line is you have to show that you care. I've sat on panels where indeed I've seen proposals where some of the PIs will only spend about half a page on the broader impact. In most cases, it's kind of unacceptable, regardless of how fantastic the intellectual merit is. Those proposals normally get ranked really low. So you have to show that you really care. And I do normally spend about 2.5 pages on my broader impact. And you have to be very specific. It's okay to give all the anecdotes and specific examples. I normally list names of students. I'm really specific as to what they've done, where they are now, and why they chose this path. And I can give you just one example that I've used in the past, which I had a student that it was an undergraduate student that wanted to do research in my lab, and it was a senior research, and he wanted to go to pharmacy school, and we had the conversation about pharmacy school and graduate school, etc. He came in my lab, he did undergraduate research, and then he decided to get into the master's program. He got his master's, he published a paper. And by the time he was finishing his master's program, he didn't want to go to pharmacy school anymore. He wanted to go to graduate school. He went to University of Kentucky, University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He's now an assistant professor at Berry College. So I just give them that story, and they like it. They're like, wow, okay, you're doing something, you get in. And he's a minority student, he's African American. So you just put the story right there. There are lots of these anecdotes you can put in and just be specific, and they actually like that. Again, just to give another example, I was in a panel and there was a broader impact that it was just, there was nothing specific. There was just this blah. And the comment you got from the panelists was that, what is this? Be specific. Give us a name. You said, okay, I've done all this, but you're not giving any specifics as to what you've actually done. So I'll kind of stop there. I do have a few more things, and I could take more questions. I can expand on that later on.
Great, thanks, Donald. Yeah, and we'll continue the conversation. Daniel, your initial thoughts?
Everybody said all my thoughts already, so I don't. That's the problem with being the last person. Yeah, so I don't want to. I definitely agree with all the things that our panelists mentioned. Couple other things that I want to emphasize, especially if you're starting, try to serve on a panel. That's when I started as assistant professor. That was one of the, I guess, you hear from senior faculty about what are the things that you need to do or things, but when you go to a panel and see how it works, basically, especially you get a better idea on the programs that you're targeting, and that gives you a perspective in terms of what's typically important for panelists in that area. And I mean, there are, depending on, again, the directorate that was mentioned, whether it's an interdisciplinary program or a specific directorate, there might be different norms in that community. So I think serving on a panel, that helps you a lot in terms of understanding what's expected. Like, for example, in our area, even program directors say the panelists in our, there's a program in cybersecurity which is an across several directorates. Typically, they say panelists are very tougher than the general NSF. And the panels that I've been on, you rarely get a proposal being ranked as very competitive. Competitive is typically the best you get. But that doesn't mean, so being there, just seeing basically how things work, that helps a lot. And other thing is when you're writing proposal, hopefully once you get that experience again, try to think like a panelist. When you're writing, again, if it's interdisciplinary or a specific directorate, you should expect a panel having people with a variety of expertise. Even if it's one program, like we're talking, for example, again, my field, cybersecurity, it's very broad. So the specific area that you're working, you might have panelists that doesn't work in that area, doesn't know much in that area. So it's kind of similar to having someone from a different field, really. So you have to be able to articulate your ideas simply enough that somebody who doesn't have a lot of background in your specific area should be able to understand pretty easily. And I think what Sarah mentioned in terms of, I want to emphasize that, I think it's very important, how someone outside your field to review the proposal. Reach out. Even if you can have someone from your area department, someone who's not necessarily in the same area that you're working, to give you feedback, but also having someone from a kind of a more distance area looking at your proposal and giving you feedback. It's very helpful. But with that comes the problem of deadlines. We usually always working until last minute when we have deadlines. So if you're expecting a senior faculty to give you feedback, give them enough time. So don't wait until a week before your deadline because everybody's busy. So that requires a little planning in advance. So to have at least, even if it's not final version, a reasonable draft, then you can send it to people in your circle and ask for feedback. So that's some of the things I wanted to mention for now, but then I guess if there are questions, we'll come back and talk about the specific issue.
Great, thanks, Daniel. I definitely have a pile of follow-up questions. I'd be happy to volunteer, but why don't we see now if any of the attendees have any specific questions they'd like to ask. I know there are at least a couple specific, I've had conversations with some of the attendees who I know are applying to programs that some of our panelists have mentioned. So please don't be shy. If there's a specific program that's on your radar in the coming months, you know, even if you don't have a specific question, throw it out there, what you're developing, what ideas you're kicking around.
So I have a generic question. For support letters, so first of all, thanks for all the tips. Some I, have tried to follow and some were new, so it's helpful. One question I have is with one of the recent changes with NSF is the support letters. Now the support letters are just that one boilerplate standard sentence, and the person providing the support letters aren't really able to add all that extra material in the letter that's like speaking as to why it would be useful, what did they see as the benefit from their end, and so some of that material is now going to eat up space into your proposal side if you want to try and add that in there. So what tips do you guys have as far as, where, when you're trying to present the technical aspects, one change is now we're spending more space on the broader impacts, and now the support letter information has to be pulled in. So there's a space crunch that I have sometimes been up against. Time always, but space too now.
Yeah, I think that policy change has created a real headache for a lot of people, especially people who have like big collaborative groups, and it's created a problem. One approach we've started using is trying to get real specific about past collaborations with the people who are providing letters of support and putting them into tables so that they're at least as concise, and you don't have to write complete narrative sentences. So we might, I'm thinking of a recent proposal where we listed out partners and the nature of the partnership in more or less bullet form so that we didn't have to spend, paragraphs explaining those collaborations. Other comments on this?
So I use facilities document also, or misuse it basically. So you could, recently a couple proposals I submitted recently, I did that. So briefly put it in project description, what's the nature of collaboration, and then have a kind of more expanded version on the facilities document. That's the only way I could go around it, but yeah, I don't know.
It's great.
I do the table too, and also the facilities document. I've done both of those. But one of the things to try to remember is that, and it's a hard balance and it depends on the discipline, but the detail on the proposal needs to be specific enough to convince the reviewers that you know what you're doing and have the capacity to do it. But it's not like the methods of a paper where it has to be absolutely every detail. So so I have a collaboration that's been ongoing and funded by NSF since 2007. So at this point, a lot of what mine is when you're supposed to convince them you've worked together and that you have the capacity to compare, we're 3 different primate facilities scattered literally across the country. we say, you know, we've been working together and have published empty number of papers since 2007 and just cite a handful of them. But then you're giving them data. You're telling them that you've had, you know, 27 papers published in the last 14 years in this specific collaboration. At that point, they shouldn't be asking for details about how you're going to have your weekly communication, because clearly you figured it out. So you can figure out where you can hold back and just cover it in a bullet point, and where you can need to go into more detail because it's something new that you haven't done previously.
Yeah, so two points from me would be essentially the same thing as Sarah said, right? Smuggling in your collaboration record, right? So if I put support there, I will always cite at least a few recent papers I have with them to kind of show that that's not just on the paper, right? Second thing, I will typically pick supporters that also have some cloud with NSF. So if I have essentially 3 supporters from the same institutions, I will pick the ones that has the best record with NSF and has a previous record. I love to get involved supporters from the research centers that are NSF funded, like for Aschara, right? Like National Solar Observatory, right? So the ones that are in part funded by NSF, because they also see this as indirect support for the institutions, right? And as I say, there's those numbers of citations, just add as many as possible. And the reason for this is this kind of novelty of interdisciplinary research in NSF funding. I think it goes away now. Now, essentially, what counts for a lot is the track record of collaborative research. And the reason for this is there's a lot of people just teaming up ad hoc, putting one proposal and never working together. And I think panelists are very much on the kind of lookout for those kind of proposals that look cool on the paper, very impressive, and yet none of the authors ever work together. And so having those collaborators that work with you for a longer period of time and have good record, that's very meaningful.
And I should throw in, I've heard this from program officers too, adding someone just because you think it'll look good. Apparently there's a real problem with people adding a collaborator in an HBCU just because it looks good because you've added an HBCU, but you're never actually planning to work with them. You're not actually doing anything with them. It was just for looks. That actually works against you. So make sure you don't add collaborators just because you think it's going to look good for whatever reason, but that it's actually someone where it's easy to explain how they tie in. If it's too convoluted to explain how it's going to actually support the grant, then maybe you don't need them on the grant.
Sarah makes a really good point that panelists are very, very suspicious of collaborations, right? Are you just using this for the sake? So I remember we had one of the proposals in the past that, really big guys from MIT listed one after another, but there was no track record, right? And there was no even funding on allocated for them to collaborate, right? So that doesn't take you much. Right? So there's this balance between, big names, but do I really have a record? Can I show it that I'm working with him or he's going to be working with me?
I just want to say thank you. I've got to hop off, but thanks for that. All right, bye.
Thanks. Other questions?
Thank you all for sharing the tips. I know that event name is NSF Grant Proposal Tips. I assume most of the tips that you are sharing should be applicable to other grant application in general. Is that right? And I have a specific question to Sarah about contacting program officer. And you mentioned that contacting NSF program officer is different compared to contacting other program officer. Could you please elaborate on that and how different is that?
Sure. NSF program officers are more overworked than NIH program officers, so they are harder to get in touch with. I mean, they will fully admit that. There are just fewer of them. So say the first thing is I have never had a program officer not get back to me and not be incredibly supportive, but it is not uncommon to send an email out and not hear back from them for a while. And so if you haven't heard after a week or so, first of all, don't send a message on a Friday. And then if you haven't heard from them in a week or so, I just send a follow-up message, just a polite, hey, I didn't know if you had gotten this, wanted to check in with you again. They are inevitably enthusiastic to talk to you. So when someone doesn't reply, don't take it as a negative and don't take it as they don't like your grant. The other thing is, just like the senior faculty, they are swamped. So pay attention to deadlines and don't email them the week before a huge deadline, even if it's not the one you're applying to. And I would never email a program officer to talk about a grant you're planning to submit less than, I mean, at bare minimum 2.5 months out, and I would say more like 6 months out. So I tend to contact program officers in January or December and say, I'm aiming for the August deadline, because that gives them a chance to have some space to get back to you, and also shows them that you're thinking ahead. I mean, we all know the students who contact us the night before something's due, and we think they haven't been planning. So, and when you do contact them, my experience is you send them an email, they will say, here, let me get you, you can get on my schedule, they'll get you a half-hour slot. And they are very good about talking through it. They'll be really honest about how it fits in. They are a little less, they're going, unlike NIH program officers, at least in my fairly limited NIH experience, they're going to be less likely to sit down and talk through the specifics of your proposal with you and how you can specifically aim details, because they have more of a say in what gets funded. But they will be very clear about overall fit, whether or not they're going to cross review it, whether you should be looking at something else, whether your broader impacts fit. They'll even tell you if they think something big is missing, if they don't like a collaborator. The best about NSF is, and I'm assuming this is true for other ones, the program officers tend to stick around for a while. So you could end up with the same program officer for 10 or 15 years. And that gives you a really nice relationship where you can contact someone and say, hey, I see this new program. What I'm doing tangentially fits. I mean, much like Donald, I am in the psychology department and in neuroscience, and I have never been funded by either psychology or neuroscience at NSF in my entire career. I'm usually funded by economics or the decision-making group. And so they will help you, and they will help you as their foci change. They will help you try to figure out how to fit what you're doing into their changing focus. And I also wouldn't be shy about sending, remember, anything that you send to them that you write down, anyone can see. So there's no problem with sending an email and saying, I have a question and I just wanted to talk to you. Can we arrange a phone call? And so don't be shy about that. Back before COVID, I used to tell people that if you were ever in DC, you should snack an extra afternoon on and go by and meet your program officer, which is probably the best thing I ever did. I have 2 main program officers and I know them both personally, and that's really helpful. So when this ends, get back on a plane and go to DC and meet your program officer.
Yeah, one thing which I would add, also think about content of your questions, right? So think about essentially communicate with someone that's very, very busy and gets probably tons of emails like this, right? So it's a broad question, like, hey, could you comment on my proposal? That's scheduling a meeting, man. That's essentially say, hey, could I either visit you or could I basically just chat with you on the phone, right? If you have quick questions, hey, could I include this guy as copy A if I know that he's already copy A on this proposal, etc., right? That's good pressure for email, right? But you could basically say, could I please talk with you whenever it will be convenient for you? And he will send you the time slot that he has when he's in the office or something like this, or visit him, right? It used to be, I think GSU still is sponsoring this kind of once per very few years, the trip to DC for the younger faculty. But that's exactly what I did at the beginning of my career. I would basically just had 3 or 4 PIs from the program directors from the NSF and NASA and just flew to DC and spent 2 days there. Try to talk with them even for half an hour. Hey, are you available during a lunch? I have a panel. I can do lunch. Can I do lunch with you, right? And basically he's eating, but he's talking to me, right? So just make yourself flexible and think about how can I get this guy who wants to maybe help me out, but he's just too busy, right? How can I help him to help me?
And actually, I think it was Daniel mentioned serving on a panel. It's funny, when I was junior faculty, everyone told me not to serve on panels, that it took too much time. And I have exactly the opposite advice. Serving on a panel is the most useful thing you can do because it will tell you how to write a grant. Because when you're reading this 12th proposal the day before your reviews are due, and then trying to remember what someone said 2 weeks later at panel, you will know why people highlight certain sentences and repeat themselves because you will get irritated. But the other thing is, your program officers who are funding you will also ask you to serve on their panels. And you should always say yes, and you should spend the whole week before preparing and think of it as an audition for funding, because they want to know, are you thoughtful? Are you careful? You know, are you the sort of person who they want to give money to? And I actually, one time, when I was on the IGERT, actually, the program officer who I didn't know, later admitted to me he needed a social scientist, and he went to my program officer and said, I need a social scientist. Who would be a good one? And my program officer gave me his name, or gave him my name. And then I'm certain that it was reported back to my program officer how I did. So, you know, consider it your audition, say yes, and do a really good job.
Yeah, one quick comment I have on that. It's funny, the area I normally find the program officers, that's actually what gave me the belief that I'm submitting to the right division, is because whenever I go to conferences, they're all there. I see them there. And in fact, the guy, I also served on the NIH MSFD panel, and the SRO also was always go to the same conferences, right? So in fact, in some cases you can have conversations with them, because the reason why they go there, my understanding, I was talking to one of them, it's like, oh, we just want to see what's going on. We're trying to look at what people are doing. And they go to a lot of the talks. And in most cases, you end up having the conversation, and then they see you and they say, oh, you need to serve on my next panel. You know, so you want to be careful, I guess, having the conversation, because you're going to end up serving on their panel. But they go to these conferences, you know, and if you know them, you can, you know, they're always there. They can talk to you. They go to all the different presentations and meetings, and you can always chat with them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's right. You're building relationship with the program director quite often for the panels, right?
Right.
It's struggling finding good panelists and good reviewers, right? So basically, if you volunteer, right, they like you. You already helped them, right? So now, if they can, they will help you, right? That's essentially just human nature. Use it.
And they will also be flexible. I mean, I've been sitting on review panels over the last year, and I have 3 young children at home that I'm busy doing virtual school with. And the first one, they said, can you sit on this panel? I need you to log on for 6 hours a day. And I emailed them back and said, I'd be happy to. There's no way I cannot be interrupted at 6 hours. And they were like, no problem. We can. It turned out the program officer who asked me had small children at home too. And so don't be afraid to say yes, but because they know you're human. So they're not going to think you're a horrible person because you admitted that you had a child and had to take care of whatever the challenge may be. They're just happy you said yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. It's to some of the stuff that Donald said about like I'm basically in computer science, and I'm working in sort of bioinformatics, and that has like health implications. Like I'm working on, for example, modeling the progression of cancer given tumor sequencing data, for example. What sort of maybe programs or whatever I could target in the NSF for something like that?
Right. So programs like that easily go into bio. There are many different possibilities in terms. I've seen a lot of proposals like that in bio, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So the one way I looked at it initially was, and there are a lot of stories or anecdotes, I guess, in that regard. I realized that the research we're doing, I look at some of the folks I postdoc with or I interact with at conferences, and I realize that I find them in chemistry, I find them in physics, I find them in bioengineering, I find them in all sorts of these departments. So they're not necessarily chemists, they're not necessarily physicists, you know, loosely they're molecular biophysics or whatever. So then that was my first way to say, okay, you know what? Let me take a closer look at all of these different programs, not just by default for chemistry, right? And then actually my postdoctoral advisor was funded through, I believe it's through MCB, right? So he wasn't funded through chemistry, even though he also was in the chemistry department. So I started taking, so that's how I ended up going to MCB. And so initially I sent the program officer an email from MCB, and I just wanted to know more about that particular division, and that's how I started my career to MCB. And I've never left MCB, pretty much, right? So yeah, so I would encourage you to look at bio for sure. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of the panel I saw I've been on in the molecular physics. I've seen proposals from faculty from many different departments, including computer science. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, one thing which I would add to this is if you go for a program different than computer science program, I would definitely look at someone from domain to at least read your proposal and review your proposal. I would try even to pull someone as co-PI or as co-I on your proposal. And the reason for this is a lot of our disciplines have our own slangs and our own dialects of communication. And if you mess that, you mess the spot, you mess the panelist, and you're gone. That's why it's even rewarding something, right? Or someone reading your proposal saying, I didn't get this part, right? That's the part that you need to focus, right? Especially with interdisciplinary kind of cross-disciplinary fields, the risk is very high, right? We're talking about this, interdisciplinary research, but lots of bioinformatics is just pure informatics, right? If you really want to go for different disciplines, right? Think about having carefully reviewed by someone else, by non-computer scientists, essentially, by the guy from the domain.
Okay.
Other thoughts, questions? Let me also mention for the audience, and actually maybe the panelists don't know this either. The research office maintains a database of awarded proposals from all agencies, and these are accessible to GSU users who request them. So if you go to the research portal, which is just, I'll type it in here, researchportal.gsu.edu. If you just go to that website and you look on the left, there's a link that says awarded proposal sharing. And if you click on that, you can request access to successful proposals where the GSU has volunteered to let other GSU faculty see these.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting trigger those proposals, right? I remember when I was assistant professor, I would kill for it, someone else's proposal, right?
Yeah.
My first proposal, it was like, can I at least get a template? And officially, it's supposed to be open document, but you will never get it from NSF, man.
Right.
That GSU is your best bet. Someone willing to share, I totally agree. I remember this. I remember when I was assistant professor like that.
And I think it's been a while since the database has been refreshed with recent awards. So I'll probably be reaching out to successful proposal writers to volunteer if they it is appropriate to put some of the proposals on there. And it's behind the password protection and it's for a limited period of time and all of that. But a lot of PIs have been very generous in sharing their proposals, and it's helpful to see that. And also, people are more than willing to have conversations with you to help you develop your proposals going forward.
And to go on that, so some NSF programs, they used to have, hopefully they would, after the situation goes back, workshops for aspiring PIs or junior faculty in terms of proposal writing. So I think if there are opportunities like that, take advantage of that. Those gives you a lot of information and also gives you potential opportunity to meet more senior faculty and ask them for their proposal samples. So I personally had that experience, but when I attended one of these workshops, I talked to a couple of people and the proposal already was funded and sometimes people don't mind sharing it. You don't get it from NSF, it's difficult, but if you meet people there, it's easier to ask them. Worst case, you say no. I mean, those are other opportunities that you can take advantage.
Any other questions? The attendees did an excellent job of hitting all of my follow-up questions, so I think we've covered the topic pretty well.
One thing which I could add for this panel, I would always say, think about your career, not about your individual proposal, right? So think about you could think about proposal writing and research building as essentially your own small business, right? It's where am I here for a long run, right? Don't write proposals like, oh, I could hit that, and it's just for fun, right? That's the wrong approach to take, right? Think about this is where I want to be in 3 years, when I want to be in 10 years, right? In this way, when you invest in the science like this, those proposals will become funding. It's just question of time, right? Just let yourself build the depth, right? If you think, oh, this is cool, I'm going to propose this, and then 3 months later there's another solicitation, and I have to shoot for it, so I'm going to just grab the papers. It's typically just going to burn you out, right? So think about this as essentially a long-term commitment, right? This is the area I want to be. There are 2 free programs. I'm going to hit them every single year, and here are my potential collaborators. I'm going to build with them every single year. And sooner or later, you will see that you will be this, 10% or 20% of the top niche, because you suddenly just spend so much time on this, right? So think about this always as the long-term commitment, not those checkbox. Okay, I need to have 2 proposals or 500,000 for career, for tenure, and that's it, right? What's the point, right? Point is essentially build, right? So you have to think about it as a path, not as just one attempt. It's hard when you're starting, but that's essentially, I think, that's this fundamental change in your approach that it was very beneficial for me.
Actually, feedback on that. Add something, some technique or idea to the proposal just because it's the current hot thing to do.
Sarah, we missed the beginning of that audio. Could you?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Don't piggybacking off of what Rafal said. Don't add something, some technique or idea to your proposal just because it's the current hot thing to do, because reviewers hate that. They want things that are consistent and fit in with this broader career and research program that you have built. So, when everybody suddenly started doing, optogenetics, all of a sudden that was not what you wanted to have on your proposal, because that was no longer helpful. So don't be afraid to just do what you do and do it well, and figure out how to figure out how to convince the readers that what you're doing is important and interesting and should be funded, rather than trying to figure out what they want to fund so much.
Well, normally this is where we probably retire to beverages and cookies over at the side, but unfortunately we'll have to put that off for another time. But please, everyone, join me in thanking our distinguished panelists, and thank you all for your contributions and the conversation. Good luck, and of course, don't hesitate to reach out to anybody in this group or not in this group. So GSPU are eager to help in proposal development.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, guys.
Have a
Bye.
good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.